Welcome to Adventure in the Everglades. It's the largest area of wetlands in the country. It also includes some of the most interesting plants and animals in the world. And it's right here in our Florida backyard. We've got a lot to see, starting with the park story. When an area is this special, and there's a need to protect it for future generations, like us, it often becomes a national park. This means that the special land is now owned by all the people in America, including you. I'll bet you didn't know that you were a landowner. In 1947, President Harry Truman made part of the Everglades a national park. It joined an impressive list of special areas all across the country that other presidents, over the years, have also turned into national parks. Places like Yellowstone in the state of Wyoming, which was America's first national park, and Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, which is made up of active volcanoes. Independence Hall in Philadelphia is another national park area. It's being preserved as a special place because it's where the Declaration of Independence was signed back in 1776. And there are other places like Arches National Park in Utah, and the Statue of Liberty in New York City, and Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. In California, there's Yosemite National Park, and the Grand Canyon in Arizona, even Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. Just some of over 370 special areas of the country we all own that are now taken care of by the National Park Service. In our state of Florida, there are 11 different national park areas, like Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, the oldest city in the continental United States. It's a national monument that was built over 300 years ago by the Spanish. Other park areas are Timucin Ecological and Historical Preserve, Fort Caroline National Memorial, Gulf Islands National Seashore, Fort Matanzas National Monument, Canaveral National Seashore, DeSoto National Memorial, Big Cypress National Preserve, Dry Tortugas National Park, and Biscayne National Park near Homestead in South Florida. This park is almost entirely underwater, so you need a mask and fins or a glass-bottom boat ride to see it. But there is a lot to see, especially around the coral reefs, where over 250 types of fish swim every day. The star of our show is Everglades National Park, or as some of us Floridians call it, the Glades. Everglades National Park covers 1.5 million acres. That's like your neighborhood times 10,000, probably more. Believe me, it's big, and it's a good thing because we need every bit of it. Everglades is truly unique. It's the only park of its kind in the world and has been named an International Biosphere Reserve and a World Heritage Site. Now that sounds important. It's kind of like being named the MVP, Most Valuable Park, of the National Park All-Star Team. To understand the Everglades, you have to look closely. The Everglades is very flat because there has been no folding or uplifting like there has been in the mountainous parts of the world. Because it is so flat, at one time the ocean used to cover this entire area. If the land rises as little as 1 foot, it can cause a big change in the plants and animals that live there. It can create a totally different habitat. What exactly is a habitat anyway? It's the area in which a plant or animal species lives. All plants and animals have their own habitat, one that's best for them. In the Everglades, there are several different habitats, and they're easiest to tell apart by the kinds of plants that grow there. There are 2 seasons that affect the different habitats, wet and dry. The 2 seasons alternate, and the plants and animals must adjust to the changing seasons. We'll talk more about the wet and dry seasons later, but for now, let's take a look at the different habitats found in Everglades National Park. The best-known habitat is the sawgrass marsh. It grows on top of the limestone floor that's under most of the Everglades. During the wet season, the water in certain areas of the marsh, especially next to the freshwater sloughs, we'll talk more about those in a minute, is deeper. Sawgrass doesn't grow as well in those areas, but sun-loving algae does. They are some of the smallest, most important plants in the marsh. When algae clumps together, it forms a mat, which is like a wet brown blanket floating on top of the water. This blanket of algae is called periphyton. Hundreds of kinds of organisms live in periphyton. Crayfish and mosquito fish live in the shallow water of the marsh and feed on the periphyton and its residents. They attract wading birds like the white ibis and great blue heron. During the wet season, all kinds of animals live in the sawgrass marsh. Alligators even pass through. A lot of these same animals live in a similar habitat called the freshwater slough, especially late in the dry season. Sloughs hold some of the deepest water in the park. They occur where natural channels have formed in the limestone floor under the Everglades. When the water in the sawgrass marsh starts to dry up, the deeper freshwater slough becomes very popular. Bigger fish, like the bass and the Florida gar, like the deeper water of the slough. So do the turtles. Even though the park's highest altitude is just 10 feet above sea level, changes in elevation of only a few inches present different habitats for plants and animals. The pineland's habitat is on land a few feet higher than the sawgrass. It's the driest part of the park and remains above water most years. The opossum and the panther like the pinelands. They like to keep their feet dry at least most of the time. Young pines need a lot of sunlight to grow. The thin needles of mature pines let the sun shine through to the growing seedlings below. There's another important element that keeps the pinelands healthy. It's fire. Every few years, fire sweeps through the pineland forest. Usually it's caused by lightning. The fire will burn up broad leaves and the other shrubs that block the sunlight from the pine seedlings. The bark on a pine is special. It's very thick and protects the inner trunk of the tree from the fire. Because the broad-leaved trees have been cleared out, the seedlings will get the sun they need to become full-grown pines. If you were wondering about the broad-leaved trees all burning up, don't worry. They grow best in another habitat, the hardwood hammock. They're like the mountains of the Everglades, even though they're only about 3 feet above the water level. A hammock is usually surrounded by lower ground that is covered with water most of the year. Like a moat round a castle, water protects the trees by preventing the fire from crossing into the hammock. Golden orb weaver spiders and tree snails like the habitat of the hardwood hammock. The broad leaves of the hardwood trees provide needed shade during the hot months. The snakes and mosquitoes enjoy the shade. Hanging out in a hardwood hammock can be very relaxing. If the hardwood hammock is the mountain of the Everglades, then the cypress dome is the valley. The cypress dome habitat occurs where the limestone floor drops about a foot. These low spots hold water most of the year, like a shallow pond. Cypress trees stand in the water. They have knees on their roots that stick up above the water. No one knows what these knees are for. The tallest trees grow in the deeper part of the pond where there's more soil, and the shorter ones at the edges. That's how a cypress dome gets its shape and its name. Attached to some of the trees are plants called epiphytes, or air plants. They're unique because they don't have roots in the ground. Instead, they attach themselves to the trees and get the water they need from the rain and dew. The cypress dome has a wide variety of animal life. Freshwater snails and fish attract wading birds like the heron and white ibis. You can probably find an otter or two as well. Following the flow of water through the sawgrass brings us closer and closer to Florida Bay. The mangrove marks the boundary where the freshwater from the sawgrass marsh meets the saltwater from Florida Bay. It's called the brackish zone. Creeks flowing through the mangroves and into Florida Bay provide a refuge to many animals during the dry season. There are three types of mangrove trees: red, black, and white. The white mangroves grow on the higher ground furthest from the shoreline. Black mangroves have special roots called pneumatophores that stick straight up out of the water. They breathe with them. The red mangroves, which grow furthest out into the water, have tall, arching roots like stilts. It looks like they could walk away. The mangrove is an important nursery for marine animals, especially the shrimp. Mangrove roots protect them while they grow. Big tarpons swim in the channels that wind through the mangroves, and wading birds, like the wood stork and great blue heron, roost in the trees. If you follow a hungry heron out of the mangroves, you might wind up in our last habitat, Florida Bay. Fed by water from the Gulf of Mexico and the brackish water of the mangrove, Florida Bay is home to a variety of marine life. Its deepest spot is only about 9 feet. During low tide, some of the shallow areas are out of the water. The exposed mud flats are home to many tiny animals that the wading birds feed on. The warm, shallow water of Florida Bay provides a good habitat for spiny lobster and blue crab. The American crocodile, a cousin of the alligator, also calls the bay home. It likes to live in the saltwater habitat. This is the only place in the country that you'll find crocodiles. You'll also see one of the bay's fastest swimming residents, the bottlenose dolphin, playing under and on top of the water. Across the whole Everglades, there doesn't seem to be another animal having more fun than the dolphin. From Florida Bay to the Pinelands, everything in Everglades National Park is connected. But the park is just a part of the whole Everglades. When we think about how to take care of the park, we really need to think about how to take care of all of South Florida. A lot of what happens outside Everglades National Park affects the plants and animals that live in the park. The National Park Service protects special places like Everglades National Park, places that belong to us. But it's our responsibility to take care of them. Let's take a time out and try some activities that will help us understand the Everglades and other national parks and plan for their future. Welcome back to Everglades National Park. The National Park Service oversees more than 370 special park areas across the country, and they all belong to us. National parks are one of a kind, different from state or county parks. They all have a special feature that makes them distinctive. A lot of parks are unique because of their natural beauty, like the Grand Canyon and Yosemite. It's up to each of us to preserve that beauty for future generations. Much of the beauty of Everglades National Park comes from the diversity of species that live there. It's also what makes the Everglades unique. What special features did you put in your park? We should definitely know exactly where the Everglades National Park is. It covers 1.5 million acres of the southern end of Florida. To the west of the park is the Gulf of Mexico, and to the northwest corner is Naples. Over to the east is the Atlantic Ocean and the city of Miami. The Caribbean Basin and all of its islands spread out to the south of the Everglades. Can you find it on this map? It's because of the Everglades location that the habitats have such a great variety of life. We can identify several different habitats just by the types of plants and animals, flora and fauna that grow and live there. We learned many new words from A to Z, from adaptation to the zebra butterfly, that help us describe each habitat. From the tiniest of microorganisms, like algae, to the largest of mammals, like the immense manatee. Each life form lives in a habitat where it has the best chance to survive. That is why the tree snail lives in the tropical hardwood hammocks of the Everglades, because they need the smooth bark trees that grow on dry land. The snails scrape and eat the minute mold-like fungi that grow on these trees. And that is why flocks of large water birds go to feed in the drying marshes and ponds where fish and other aquatic life are plentiful. Although many plants and animals are found in only one habitat, others, like the alligator, have adapted to several habitats: the cypress slough, the sawgrass marsh, and the mangrove estuary. You can observe wild alligators basking in the sun or digging ponds throughout the interior of the park. All of these habitats are different, but they do have one thing in common, and that's water. We will learn more about the importance of water to the Everglades when we come back. See you then! Welcome back to Adventure in the Everglades.
Everglades National Park is home to many plants and animals. They all live in and share the different habitats that the park provides. But there's one thing that every living plant and animal in the park has in common. It's the one thing that they all depend on for survival. That's water. Water is the lifeblood of the Everglades. It's the one thing that every habitat in the park needs to stay healthy. The whole ecosystem depends on water. The Everglades is really a river. In fact, it's called the River of Grass. It's the most unusual river in the world, over 50 miles wide and a few inches deep, and it moves very, very slowly. It takes all day for the water to travel only a quarter of a mile, about the length of 4 football fields. 200 years ago, before man started changing the land in South Florida, the water that fed the Everglades started its journey at the top of the Kissimmee River up near Orlando. From there, it flowed south, filling Lake Okeechobee. When the water level in the lake rose above its banks, it would spill over at the southern edge, and from there, the River of Grass began its slow, life-giving journey through the Sawgrass Marsh. 75 years ago, the Everglades was more than twice as big as it is today. Billions of gallons of water flowed through it and into Florida Bay each year. Then, as now, the Everglades also received a tremendous amount of water in the form of rainfall during the summer wet season. The clean water and natural flow were the foundation that the Everglades depended upon. The life of every type of plant and animal is tied to the pattern of the wet and dry seasons. The alternating wet and dry seasons of the Everglades is called the seasonal water cycle. This cycle is kind of like a big clock of the Everglades. The wet season happens between May and November, and it rains almost every day. In December, the daily rain stops and the dry season begins. By January or February, the shallow water that had covered the Sawgrass Marsh is drying. Only the deep water areas, like the freshwater slough and alligator holes, still hold water. For hundreds of years, all the plants and animals have adapted their lives to the alternating seasons of wet and dry. As the dry season begins, some fish in the Sawgrass Marsh find their way to the deeper pools of water. Others get trapped in small pools of water in the marsh and become food for birds. Those that found their way to the deeper pools are followed by animals that feed on them. Soon, all animal life concentrates in these deep water areas. Here they can find food while waiting for May and the return of the wet season. In times of severe drought, even the deepest pools can dry out. This is when the alligator becomes the keeper of the glades. He cleans dirt out of the deepest depressions. As the dirt and debris is removed, the depression fills with water and attracts fish. The fish attract larger fish, which in turn attract wading birds. Some of the gator holes, because of the water supply, become an entire community. There are 4 important parts to the natural water supply of the Everglades: the quantity, or how much water; the quality, how clean it is; the distribution, where it flows; and timing, when the water flows. Unfortunately, the needs of the growing cities and farms have affected all four. To build the farms and cities, land that was once Everglades was drained and cleared. A system of canals was dug to drain water off the land and to keep them from re-flooding. Much of the water that would have traveled through the Everglades was channeled to the Atlantic coast. Next, to supply growing farms and cities with their own water supplies, large holding areas were built and water was stored, changing the natural flow even more. In addition to these problems, much of the water that was still following its natural course through the Everglades was polluted on the way by fertilizers used on the farms and sewage and chemicals from towns and cities. It's pretty obvious that the water supply to the Everglades has been totally changed. The quantity of water, or how much, has dropped by billions of gallons a year. The quality of water, or how clean it is, has been polluted by fertilizers, chemicals, and sewage. The distribution, where the water flows, has shrunk from a wide sheet entering the Everglades to a few small source areas where floodgates allow water to pass. The timing, or when the water flows, has changed from the natural wet and dry seasonal cycle to an inconsistent pattern of storing and releasing water through floodgates that are open and closed by man. These changes have had a big effect on all the life in the Everglades. One example is the wood stork. As the Everglades move from the wet season to the dry season, the wood storks know it will soon be time to nest and raise their young. Wood storks are big eaters, and when their eggs hatch, they're going to have to bring home a lot of fish to keep their young happy and healthy. Have you ever seen a wood stork fish? It's pretty tricky, and it's why they depend on the timing of the water flow. Lowering its long open bill into shallow water, the wood stork stands and waits. It doesn't look for fish, it feels for them. When a fish moves between its open bill, the wood stork snaps it shut and snatches the fish from the water. The dry season, when the fish are concentrated in a few areas, is the only time when the wood storks can bring home enough fish to feed their young. They need at least 4 months of good fishing for their babies to survive. If the dry season starts too late in the cycle, the wood storks won't have enough time to raise their young before the rains of the wet season begin again and the fish leave the ponds. Since man started controlling the water flow to the Everglades, the wood stork population has dropped. Some years, the wood storks won't even try to nest. And when they do try, their young often die because they can't catch enough fish to feed them. It's easy to see how important the flow of water is to the wood storks and all the plants and animals. But guess what? It's just as important to us. All the water that the people in South Florida use for drinking, cooking, washing, even swimming, began at the same place, in the Everglades. As the water moves into the Everglades, it doesn't just flow on top of the ground, it also soaks into it. The whole Everglades, in fact all of South Florida, sits on top of limestone. It's 10 miles deep, straight down. Did you know that rocks can absorb water? They can, and limestone is practically a sponge. The water that slowly seeps through the limestone will finally reach the Biscayne Aquifer. An aquifer is a natural well where water gathers way below the ground surface. By the time it reaches the aquifer, the water is much cleaner because limestone, together with the wetland plants, acts like a filter. Much of the fresh water for South Florida comes from the Biscayne Aquifer. And where did it all start? The Everglades. Water is the lifeblood of the Everglades, and it's the lifeblood of the people, too. Taking care of the water supply to the Everglades is the most important thing we can do. Let's try some activities that will help us understand how important water is and how we can take care of it. The future of the Everglades is up to us, and it's all about water. Welcome back to Everglades National Park. You might have heard the saying, Water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Well, the single most important thing that we learned about the Everglades is that clean water is essential to all life forms there. Water used to be everywhere in the Everglades, when a clean and natural supply flowed through Lake Okeechobee and then into the Everglades. That was before man started changing the land in South Florida. As the population of South Florida grew, portions of land in the Everglades were cleared and drained to prevent flooding. Canals were dug to reroute water into the Atlantic. Now, man tries to mimic the natural flow that once served an abundant natural world, but could not provide for a growing human population. It's pretty obvious that the water supply of the Everglades has been drastically changed, but the water still wanders through a maze of islands, and its beauty has inspired many great minds to write famous stories and beautiful poetry. Did your poem about the water convey its importance to every living thing? Water is so very important to the Everglades that we recognize only two seasons down here, wet and dry. But just how wet and how dry it is each year depends on man, not on nature anymore. A long time ago, water flowed southward from Lake Okeechobee toward the southern and southwestern coastline of Florida. Each year, bird nesting and other life cycles were timed to the amount of water available. A variety of plants and animals adapted to the natural changes in water levels. When the natural flow of water was disrupted, the health of the Everglades declined. Most of the environmental problems we face relate to water. Without enough clean water in the right place at the right time, the Everglades cannot survive. If one of these parts, the quantity, the quality, distribution, or timing is affected, a chain reaction occurs. For example, if the water level is too deep, the wading birds will have trouble finding food for their young. If it is too dry, the fish and other water inhabitants cannot breed and survive. If the level is too high, the eggs of alligators drown. Since all plants and animals, including humans, depend on water for survival, we must be willing to work together, starting right now, to keep the Everglades water supply clean and reliable. A sponge is a good way to describe the water-bearing limestone underlying the Everglades. We learned how it works. When it rains, the limestone acts like a sponge to absorb and collect water. It forms an underground reservoir called the Biscayne Aquifer. The aquifer supplies the counties of Dade, Broward, Monroe, and Palm Beach with all their freshwater needs. That's a lot of people bathing, cooking, cleaning, and drinking water. So, if a wet sponge represents the limestone in the Everglades, it's easy to see that only so much water can be squeezed out. Then we have to look somewhere else for more water. The water in the Everglades is not unlimited. As farmers, developers, and the rest of the growing population competed for the same water that the Everglades needed, the sponge was squeezed dry and the problems began. Now that we know how important water is to the Everglades, to the plants and animals, and to all of us, we must all help to maintain a clean water supply to and from the Everglades. After all, water is the one thing that all the plants and animals depend on to survive. But they also depend on each other. If one plant or animal is removed from the Everglades, all of the others are affected. We'll learn more about that when we come back. Welcome back to Adventure in the Everglades. When you look at all the animal species that live in the Everglades, it's easy to see their differences. The pig frog and the tree snail are obviously different than the white-tailed deer. The deer is a mammal and it spends most of its time in the drier areas of the park. But the pig frog is an amphibian and would rather spend its time in the water. Or how about the bottlenose dolphin and the bald eagle? How different are they? The eagle spends most of its life soaring through the air or perched high in a tree, while the dolphin lives its entire life swimming in the waters of Florida Bay. No matter how different these animals seem, they all play important parts in each other's lives. It's called interdependence, and it's how all the life in the Everglades is related. The health of the Everglades is directly connected to the health of all the plants and animals that live there. And the most important thing for healthy plants and animals is a good place to live, a healthy habitat. Just like us, plants and animals need food, water, shelter, and space for survival. From the manatee in Florida Bay to the periphyton in the sawgrass marsh, every living organism in the Everglades is connected by what we call food webs. The algae and the periphyton mats that it forms are really important to life in the Everglades. They're the beginning of important food webs that eventually support all the life in the park. Do you think something as small as periphyton is important to alligators? It sure is, and here's why. The periphyton is food for a lot of small organisms, like mosquito larvae. The insect larvae are an important source of food for the mosquito fish and other smaller fish, which then become food for bigger fish like the largemouth bass and the Florida gar. These bigger fish are an important food source for the raccoons, otters, and other animals. Who do you think might come next in this food chain? How about the alligator? When it gets hungry, the alligator will eat anything that looks like a good meal. You can see how the life of one organism depends on the survival of all the others. Without the periphyton, the egret wouldn't have any fish to eat. And then what would the alligator do for dinner? The Everglades has a lot of different food webs, and they're all connected. That's interdependence. The plants and animals of the park also depend on their own abilities for survival. That's called adaptation. Take a look at the alligator. As it swims along, what are the three parts of its body that stay above water? The nose, ears, and eyes. They're on top of an alligator's head, and when the rest of its body is underwater, it can still see, hear, smell, and breathe. It is well adapted to live in the water. An adaptation is when a plant or animal develops special characteristics to help it survive in its environment. Look at the beak of the snail kite. As you probably guessed from the name, its main source of food is the snail, specifically the freshwater apple snail. The curve in its beak helps the snail kite pull the apple snail from its shell. The curved beak is an adaptation. It helps the snail kite survive. But even with its curved beak, the snail kite is having a difficult time surviving. The greatest danger to any species of plant or animals is the change in its habitat. Because of the effect man has had on the natural water flow and the habitats, there are plants and animals in the Everglades whose survival is threatened, like the loggerhead turtle. The loggerhead is considered a threatened species because the number still living has dropped to a dangerously low level. Some plants, like the kunti plant in the pinelands, and some animals, like the Florida panther, are in even worse shape than the loggerhead turtle. Their numbers have dropped so low that they have been placed on the endangered species list. And if the very last members of any species of plant or animal die, that species becomes extinct. What animals can you think of that have become extinct? How about these guys? The dinosaurs. Scientists have several theories about why dinosaurs became extinct, but they agree that the main reason was a change in their habitat. One theory is that a large asteroid collided with the Earth. The collision sent billions of tiny particles flying into the atmosphere, creating a huge dust cloud. This blocked sunlight, which lowered the Earth's temperature and killed a lot of plant life. The dinosaurs' habitat changed so much that they just couldn't survive anymore, and they became extinct. The same thing can happen today in the Everglades, but instead of it being caused by an asteroid, it's being caused by man. Let's take another look at our friend, the snail kite. The kite has become an endangered species because of the changes in the quantity and quality of water. The apple snail that the kite feeds on attaches its eggs to sawgrass, just above the high water level. If too much water is released into the park through the floodgate, these eggs will be flooded. Also leading to the destruction of the apple snail's habitat is polluted water. It may cause a decrease in oxygen which apple snails need to survive. So, in a few short years, the habitat could be changed enough that the last of these snail kites die, and another species of animal becomes extinct. Because of the interdependence of all the species of life in the Everglades, we need to be very careful not to upset any of the different habitats. Life in the park is so closely connected that to endanger one species of animal could eventually threaten many others. Let's try some activities that will help demonstrate the interdependence of life in the Everglades and help us to protect it so that no species has to face extinction. Welcome back to Everglades National Park. Before we got started learning about the Everglades, you probably thought of it as a large area of flat land with some trees and swamps. But now we know there is a lot going on in the river of grass. There's alligators, birds, plants, fish, mammals, and insects that live in this wilderness. Some of the plants and animals in the park are not doing so well. Their survival has become threatened by loss of habitat and a change in the way that the water flows into the park. Reproductive cycles of birds, alligators, and other wildlife depend on water. If they can't reproduce, the population of that species can dwindle to numbers so low that they are placed on the endangered species list. And then we know what happens when the very last of any species of plant or animal die, right? Like the dinosaurs, they become extinct. The Florida panther is another example of an endangered species. Reduced to a population of about 30, the Florida panther once ranged throughout the state. Now, the only wild Florida panthers are in South Florida. And we learned that the snail kites are also endangered. It may be that pollutants in the water are causing apple snails, the snail kite's main source of food, to die. Can you think of any plants that are on the endangered species list? Major research is underway to assure the survival of all the endangered species in the Everglades so they don't become extinct. So many factors affect the plants and animals that live there, but especially man's interference with nature. Diversion of water, construction of roads, and agricultural pollutants affect the delicate ecosystem. If the habitats are destroyed, the plants and animals face danger of extinction. We understand the difference between endangered and extinction. Extinction is final, never to return, gone forever. That is why it is so important that we take special care of the plants and animals on the endangered list, because they are in danger of becoming extinct. More than a dozen species that live in the Everglades are now on that list, meaning there are still some left. That is why the National Park Service works so hard to prevent the extinction of these animals by preserving their habitat, and rangers learn more about them through scientific study. Man is the major cause of habitat destruction to the Everglades environment. Man must be a part of the solution, and we all have to help. What is the danger to us if one more species becomes extinct? Well, it goes back to the food webs. Each species has a place and purpose in the food web. Although each animal or plant may seem very different, they all play an important part in each other's survival. We learned that means that each species is interdependent. All life forms in the Everglades are related. From the periphyton that feed insect larvae, that feed small fish, that feed large fish, that feed other animals, we know how the life of one species depends on the survival of all the others, including man. We all love to watch the alligators in the Everglades. Not only are they interesting to watch, we learn how important they are to life in the Everglades. Because when the weather gets dry and the water levels are low, the gators dig ponds at low places. These ponds, called gator holes, provide a place for snails, frogs, and fish to live until the water level rises. These small animals provide food for the large wading birds, and the life cycle can continue successfully and without interruption. Gator holes demonstrate why interrelationships are necessary for the survival of several species, both plant and animals. The ability to survive in the Everglades is no longer dependent only on nature.
We now know that a species of animal or plant becomes threatened when the known number that are living drops to a dangerous level. Park rangers and wildlife experts try to find the cause of the population loss and correct it. But if the number continues to drop, the animal or plant becomes endangered. Just like it was for the dinosaur, a change in habitat is usually the problem for the threatened and endangered species in the Everglades. With research, testing, and adjustments, hopefully we will still be able to speak of the beauty of the Everglades, of the Florida panthers, the wood storks, the snail kites, and all other living things that have immortalized the Everglades as the River of Grass. So now we have a better understanding of the Everglades and its value to all living things. Over the years, thousands of other students have participated in classroom activities, just like the ones we did in this program. That is because the future of the Everglades is in our control. We learned why we have national parks, how plants and animals are interrelated, and that water is one of the most vital issues facing the Everglades today. This leads us to the conclusion that its survival depends on each one of us. Each one of us can help make sure that the plants and animals have the very best chance of survival. Recycling, conserving electricity and water, and learning more about the Everglades are just some of the ways that we can all do our share. Using the information we learned, let's try again to create our own national park. This time, think about what would make the perfect park. Will you charge admission? How will you get visitors? How will you protect the wildlife? Just remember, we are all the future of the Everglades, and that national parks are living classrooms. Think of that as you recreate your national parks.
Welcome to the Teacher's Guide for our Adventure in the Everglades program. My name is Sandy Dayhoff, and I'm a park ranger here at Everglades National Park. As educators, we all realize the importance of getting students actively involved in what they're learning. And that's why the activities described in your activity guide are such an important component of this curriculum module. They're all curriculum-based, and they were developed and field-tested by teachers, students, and the park's environmental education staff. And best of all, they work. The video introduces them to the Everglades and some of the problems it faces. The interactive activities reinforce the concepts introduced in the video and give students a fun way to address some of those problems. This video segment will show how easy it is to coordinate the activities and how much fun your class will have in participating in them. Now let's take a closer look at the activities in action.
As you've seen, the video program has been organized into 3 units. The park story, it's all about water and depending on each other. The activity guide for teachers is organized in the same manner. Each unit contains 3 activities. You are encouraged to be flexible when using the materials and should feel free to adapt them to your special needs. Unit 1, the park story, introduces the children to the National Park Service and why we have national parks. One of the activities for Unit 1 is called Create a National Park. By having the children use their imagination to create their own mini park, it helps familiarize students with the purpose of our national parks.
Boys and girls, today we're going to talk about parks. Do you all know what parks are?
Yeah.
How about a national park? Have you heard about a national park?
It's a place where they have endangered animals.
How would you like to make your own national parks?
Yeah!
Would you? All right, let's get started. Each pair, take your kit, and you go find your very own national park. Go on and get started. Well, I'm surprised that the materials are so simple. All I needed was string for boundaries, a few little markers, and some paper for the kids to make maps for their national parks. We chose something that was just between the 2 wings in our school. Any place with grass, a few trees, any kind of bushes, anything that the kids can use for a natural little small ecosystem.
and it's gonna lead up to the mountain. It's a shell. Look down there, right over here. I think it would be fun to be a park ranger. I think it would be fun to explore parks and to see all the animals. We don't have any park rangers in our park, so we have to depend on our brochure. It says everything on the front, but on the back it explains what we have. I learned that it's hard for people to keep up the national parks and fix everything and plant trees.
My students had interactions that I haven't experienced for a long time or seen and witnessed, but they also got something more. They got the experience and the sense of wonder and the joy and thrill and excitement of visiting their own little miniature national park. The kids also got a chance to experience the problems that national parks have, something that we didn't even foresee. Kids saw that children and overpopulation or too many visitors damaging their things.
They stepped on all these plants and I have to fix them all now.
They made great use of the natural environment that they set their park up in, and some children even went so far as to manipulate or create their own historic sites that were created by man. So they got to experience both the natural and the cultural or the historic sites as well. I had a ball out here with the kids. This was cooperative learning at its best.
In Unit 2 of the video program, entitled It's All About Water, students learn that the Everglades is actually a wide, slow-moving river. The great importance of water in the park is explained in this segment and is then reinforced with an activity called We're Sponging Off the Everglades.
Okay, boys and girls, when we talk about the Everglades, the one all-important magic word is what? What is water? And we know that the water is crucial for the Everglades to survive, for the animals, for the plants, for the people who live in and around the Everglades. And we need to know exactly how the water gets into the Everglades, how much of it needs to get there at certain times of the year. So let's just review a little bit about how the water gets to the Everglades today. What was really great about doing this activity is that all of the materials were easy to make. The limestone rock was picked up outside of my classroom, and we used that and some sponges to equate the limestone bed in Florida and the sponges that held the water, similarly the way that the limestone holds the water. The signs for the farmer, the developer, the population of South Florida, and the Everglades was made very quickly with poster board and markers and a little piece of yarn. The buckets to hold water were in the classroom, and so I think that all the materials that any teacher would need would be more than readily available. And I was very lucky that some of the parents of the children happened to have some hard hats and farmer hats, and all the kids had hats from Disney World to represent the population of South Florida. Nothing had to be bought from outside. There was no expense whatsoever, which I think is important when teachers have to do activities in school, that they are not put in a position of having to expend their own money. Let's see how they use the water in the Everglades. First, our farmer. Come on down and show us how you use the water in the Everglades today. They use water to water their crops. What are some of those crops? Go ahead and give a little squeeze and show us how you're watering your sugar cane and your beans and your strawberries. Okay, farmers are using up the water, and it doesn't go right back into the Everglades. Okay, thank you, farmer. And the other people that we have are people called developers. Would our developer come down? Chad. And how do you use water from the Everglades?
Build houses
You build houses and apartment houses, office buildings, and show us how much water you use from the Everglades. Okay? Give a good score. Okay, you use a lot of water because a lot of people are moving to South Florida. And Chad, the developer, wants as many houses as he can for those people. Other people who use the water from the Everglades, we call the population of South Florida. Tourists coming to see Goofy and Mickey Mouse at Disney World. People coming down to watch the Dolphins play and the Miami Heat play. How do they use up the water, Carolina?
They take bathrooms, wash their hands.
Okay, the same as we do. More population, more water uses. Show us how much water you use from the Everglades. A lot of water is used by the population of South Florida that is growing by 800 people every single day. And finally, water left for the Everglades. Rachel, come and show us how much water is left for you and all your friends in the Everglades. And squeeze it right back into there because that represents the Everglades. How much is left? How much is left? Show us how much is left for the Everglades, Rachel. And all that water, here, let's just pour it out and see how much has been left from the Everglades today. Not enough. After the students understood how the water traveled from the Kissimmee Basin into Lake Okeechobee and down into the Glades, the students were able to see how much water is used by the different people in South Florida and just how much is left over for the Everglades. And we found out that after everybody used it, by just squeezing the sponges into the basins, that there really wasn't much water left for the Everglades.
I learned about the limestone that it holds the water just like a sponge. And if too many people try to use the water, there's hardly any left for the Everglades.
I learned that over 800 tourists come and move into Florida, and I learned that they use tons and tons of water.
What I think the kids get out of it is some real life information that they can begin to use now and apply it later on when they grow up to understand that they are the future, that the Everglades depends on their actions, what they do, and it begins with education in the classroom. This lesson has taught them that it's everybody's job to conserve water, pass laws to protect the Everglades.
Another activity for Unit 2 is called Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades, and the rainy season in 3 cups.
All right, boys and girls, today we've been studying about the Everglades, and today we're going to talk about these 3 cups that have special meaning. We're going to be talking about Lake Okeechobee, rainy days in the Everglades, and you're going to find out what these cups have to do with it. First of all, I want you to take your map and look at it real quick, and would you point to where Lake Okeechobee is there? Okay. Now, what does Lake Okeechobee have to do with what we're studying about? First of all, where do you think the water from Lake Okeechobee comes from? This is a very simple activity. You need your paper with your map showing your Everglades. Then you also, I asked the kids to have a blue crayon to focus in on Lake Okeechobee. Then very simple, just have your 3 cups and you have a container with your water and pour it, and that covers the activity. Because of evaporation. Water is used from the Everglades by you all. Remember we studied about you're the population and you use the water. And I'm going to first of all give it to Edgardo. Would you show us about water for drinking? Okay, so this represents from our population that drinks water. Jonathan, can you tell me another way we use the Everglades water?
Take a bath.
Okay. All right, very good. Allison, can you tell me another way that we use the Florida water?
To have fun.
Okay, to have fun. Now, can you tell me what we mean by having fun with water?
Like swimming in it.
Okay, that's very good. We certainly swim, and when we swim, you get your hair wet, your bathing suit wet, and you come out and you take water out. Travis?
Watering plants.
All right, definitely we need to water our plants. Why do we need to water our plants, Travis?
Because some plants you can live off, like broccoli and vegetables.
Okay, they're for our vegetables, and if we didn't give them water, what would happen?
They would die, and some of the people would die because, like, farmers use crops to live.
Okay, so it would affect the farmers a lot too, and it would affect us because we wouldn't have food to eat. Okay, very good.
We learned different ways how to use the water, and we learned a good lesson not to waste water, because it's very important. If the water in the Everglades gets used up, the animals will not have any food to live on, and we won't have any food to live on either. And we won't have water to cook our food, and we'll die of thirst and of hunger.
This activity is very important because of the visualization. They get to see the water poured, they get to see the loss of water. And this is one of the main things we're trying to get children to aware of and adults aware of, that every time we use water, we're losing the water. And eventually, there will be no water left, and there will be no water for us. We want the children to be aware every time you use water, you lose water.
and it's very important that we conserve our water. It's one of our most precious commodities, and if we don't have water, we will have people that are become thirsty, our land will become thirsty, our Everglades will be no more, and we certainly want to conserve our Everglades.
The last video segment, Depending on Each Other, introduces the concepts of interdependence and adaptation as they relate to the Everglades. One of the activities for this segment has the children creating their own food chain.
Boys and girls, we're going to be working on our food chain. When you see your food chain, you notice that they are hooked together. I want you to take your strip and make your first chain. Glue it together. After you've done that, please look at your picture and find your alligator. Take your alligator and color your alligator, and then please cut out your alligator and paste it on the first part of our beginning of our food chain. Okay, now we're ready to make the next link in your chain. If you'll take your next link, hook it together, glue it together. What is going to be the next after the alligator? What is the next link in our chain? The fish.
Where's the Everglades kite? It's that bird. Thank you. You're welcome.
I'm a firm believer that children learn by doing, and they actually experience the idea of a lynx together. By doing this project, they see how an alligator and a fish hook together, how they belong together, and forge a chain. We have the alligator, and I want you to take the fish, and I want you to rip the fish out of there, because we had a very dry season in the Everglades, and there weren't many mosquito fish. What has happened here? Here's the alligator, here's the mosquito larvae. What's going to happen to the alligator? All right, he's going to die. Why? All right, he has no fish to eat. And what's going to happen to the mosquitoes that were laid in the water?
They're going to multiply and they're going to start biting us.
Okay, and that's not good to be bitten by mosquitoes, is it? Okay, very good. The food web is basically the same thing, except they get a piece of construction paper and they're given string, and they take and make a web just like a spider web, and then they take an animal and put in the center. And for instance, the alligator made a fish on one string going out here, but he also eats birds, so that goes on another string. Then birds also eat fish, so they're strung together.
Oh, where's mine?
Here at Everglades National Park, we found these activities to be very successful in helping young visitors better understand the park's fragile ecosystem. Many of these same activities have been in use by our staff for over 25 years in the park's environmental education program. They're an integral part of the overall presentation. We hope that you enjoy them as much as the thousands of teachers and students who participate in our on-site program. This video program, combined with the interactive classroom activities, will give your students the basic information they need to understand their role in preserving the Florida Everglades. By your helping to plant the seeds of knowledge in tomorrow's leaders, we provide hope that the Everglades will receive the consideration it needs to survive and to prosper.